Hi and welcome. Two welcomes here. First of all, welcome to International Women's Day, but more pertinent to being here, welcome to our special event on the war in the Ukraine. My name is Dr. Sepp Kempf. I'm a senior lecturer in peace and conflict studies here in the School of Political Science and International Studies, and I'll be chairing our special event here today. Before we kick things off, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet here today and pay my respect to their ancestors and descendants. Great to see you all, both here in the room, also for you coming in through Zoom online. The events that have been unfolding in Europe over the last fortnight, roughly, obviously have left many of us shocked, puzzled, questioning, sometimes angry, maybe afraid. We've seen it in the news. It has dominated world politics. It has probably been part of a lot of conversations, discussions we've all have had with one another over the last 10 to 14 days. And so I think it's only appropriate for us as the School of Political Science International Studies to run an event. And we're very glad that we have a colleague from the School of Law also join us for it here. And of course, a very stellar lineup of experts who in different ways can cover and speak to the different nuances we find about the war in Ukraine. So let me quickly introduce them to you. Okay, so we have on my far end, on your left here, Dr. Lawrence Saunders, a senior lecturer in the School of Law. And Lawrence's research is predominantly focused on international criminal law, international humanitarian law, and domestic counterterrorism law. Then we have, ladies first still, on my immediate right, on your right as well, we've got Dr. Sarah Teat, who is a senior research fellow in Pulses and whose research focuses predominantly on Chinese foreign policy in relations to international intervention, peacekeeping, and humanitarian emergency responses. And then in the middle here, we've got further to my right, Associate Professor Andrew Phillips, who is an associate professor in international relations and in strategy. In his research, Andrew focuses predominantly on the global state systems evolution from the 1500s until the present. And he's interested in questions of contemporary security challenges. And then last but not least, we've got Chris Roy-Smith, who is a professor of international relations. Chris' research focuses on the institutional nature and evolution of the international system, issues of international theory, international law, human rights, and most recently, cultural diversity and international order. The format we're going to run this in is as follows. We're going to have each of our four panelists kick this off for 5 minutes with their kind of takeaway messages, how they look at this conflict, and then we turn it over for Q&A with you guys here in the room and also for people through Zoom here as well. Okay, so welcome again, and I think I'll ask Lauren to kick this off. Thank you, Lauren.
Just checking if you can hear up the back. Yep, great. Well, thanks for having me today. I think to start off with, as far as the international legal issues are concerned, they probably create a fairly good bookmark for what the political issues are that follow in respect of what has been denounced by the international community as an illegal invasion of Ukraine. So I want to cover the three main areas of international law that are triggered or that are affected by this particular issue. The first is known as jus ad bellum, or the laws to resort to the use of force, or the law of going to war. Then talking about the laws during the conduct of hostilities, so international humanitarian law. Most militaries will refer to that as the laws of armed conflict. And then I also want to touch on the issue of enforcement, because there's been a lot of discussion about war crimes, the crime of aggression, and what could be done in terms of holding individuals to account. So in respect of the actual invasion itself, I think we have in some commentaries forgotten that Ukraine has been in an armed conflict of some description since 2013. So whether it was non-international or an internationalized, non-international armed conflict is up for debate. But it's quite clear that as of the Russian military entering into the Ukrainian territory last week, the week before last, that we're now in an international armed conflict. Now, this invasion breaches one of the fundamental premises of the international legal order, which is that it is unlawful to acquire territory through the use of force. So the United Nations Charter, Article 2.4, makes it quite clear that that's an unlawful action. And effectively, the post-World War II order was premised around that concept that might is no longer right, that you can't acquire territory through the use of force. So the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations General Assembly resolution has all recognised that this action by Russia is not legitimate. There is no justification under the current international legal order for those actions. You might have heard discussions or suggestions that there was an action to prevent genocide in the Donetsk and the Luhansk region, that Russia was claiming that their action was in response to that genocide. The International Court of Justice has come out and said flatly that the facts don't support that, and then that's not true. And more to the point, that's not a justification to invade another country. In the same way that there was a declaration by Putin recognising those two regions as new states, under international law, that also doesn't hold sway on the basis that those states, those regions don't qualify for statehood under any international legal test. Equally, the United Nations General Assembly resolution rejected that premise outright. And so, in a quite unusual or irregular activity, noting that Russia has a veto power under the United Nations Security Council. There was no United Nations Security Council resolution that was adopted in a substantive way to authorise any measures in response to the invasion. But a resolution did pass that passed the United Nations General Assembly, where all members took a vote where they denounced the action and stated that there was no recognition of those regional areas as independent states. Noting, of course, the test for statehood includes things like being recognised by other states, and also that they have the capacity, that state has the capacity to enter into government and to engage in international relations with other countries, which those two states don't have. Claims of denazification and demilitarisation because of threats of NATO expansion also didn't hold sway or don't hold sway as justification for the resort to the use of force. Effectively, the only lawful use of force under the international legal order is in defence of your country. So in this case, Ukraine is lawfully using force under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter to respond to the threats of force or to respond to the military invasion by Russia. So as far as the actual resort to force in the first instance, it's widely recognised that it's unlawful. A lot of people have commented, though, that this is a watershed moment for the international legal order, that this is recognised, or this is a demonstration of the collapse of that legal order. And I think probably a better way to look at this is that whilst there has been a red line that has absolutely been crossed, this allows an opportunity for states to coalesce in their response to that red line that has been crossed. So this is just one instance of the charter that has been established since World War II not working. But in the same way that we don't throw out our domestic criminal code because murder is illegal and someone murders someone, in this case, because someone has unlawfully invaded another country, we're not going to throw out the entire legal regime that is in existence to create rules and then sanctions and countermeasures to respond to those people that don't follow those particular rules. So that's the big picture international law piece. Now that there is an international armed conflict, within that international armed conflict, because it is a state-on-state conflict, so we're talking two military forces against each other, the international humanitarian law applies, so we're talking Geneva Convention laws. So because it is international, Geneva Conventions 1 through to 4 will apply. Things like people who are being detained who are from the military have prisoner of war status, for example. But the broader set of customary international law rules that apply to how conflicts are meant to be conducted lawfully are in play. So we've seen a lot of conduct that would breach those fundamental principles, things like targeting civilians. I think today was the third or the fourth attempt at humanitarian corridors to be established to let civilians escape the conflict zones. Things like targeting facilities with dangerous forces, so nuclear weapons, nuclear power facilities, for example, are a really great indication of that particular issue being breached. So it is unlawful to target something that contains dangerous forces for obvious reasons. It's unlawful to target nuclear facilities. Targeting of civilians, indiscriminate attacks, all of those things. When it comes to those breaches of international humanitarian law, the third consideration is really about enforcement. So people have been talking about how to hold Putin accountable for the actual invasion itself, and then secondly, what to do with the individuals who breach the international humanitarian law rules that apply to the conduct of conflict itself. So as far as the international humanitarian law rules are concerned, everyone will have heard that the International Criminal Court has opened an investigation now. Whilst the Ukraine has agreed to the jurisdiction, they're not a member of the Rome Statute, neither is Russia. While they've agreed to the jurisdiction from 2014 till now, it means the ICC can investigate war crimes. But the ICC has a pretty high threshold in dealing with anyone who has committed these offences. So it would be in the future or during the course of this conduct or this conflict that there will be investigations into misconduct for those higher level instances of breaches of the law. As far as the lower levels of breaches are concerned, so the individual soldiers, there's an obligation upon the states to actually take account or to punish their own individual members. And as far as Putin is concerned, from the aggression side of the house, this has really demonstrated that there is a bit of a lacuna in international law when we have a veto-holding member of the United Nations Security Council committing the aggression. So there have been some calls for a special tribunal to be established, similar to what occurred following World War II for Nuremberg, to try and address that potential position of aggression. A whole heap of other complications have come out from a legal perspective as well, looking at things like the International Court of Justice declaring provisional measures if the genocide case that's before them is decided in Ukraine's favour in a timely fashion, looking at social media from a documentary perspective, but also for its use for recording crimes, and then also on the other side of that, thinking about the deep fakes that we're seeing as well. So how can we rely on what we're seeing on the internet to support those convictions? And the other thing from an Australian perspective is the laws of neutrality. So you will have heard that Australia has committed cyber expertise and also provided some weapons to the Ukrainian military forces. There is a set of rules that relate to neutrality at international law as well, that say that if you're staying out of the conflict, you have to stay out of the conflict effectively. So we're now talking about consideration of belligerent neutrality. So we've picked a side. We've said that Russia is the aggressor, so we can provide this support to the Ukraine legally and still not be a party to the conflict. And then finally, some complications with civilians in the actual conflict as well, being targeted by Russia and also partaking in the conflict. So just some other food for thought, but thank you.
Great. Tuil, thank you very much. Which of course we'll have time to pick up and go in depth as well. Thanks so much, Lauren. Chris, over to you.
Okay, so some of what I'm going to say will overlap with what Lauren's done. But what I'd like to do is to really shift the gear a little bit and focus on what the implications of the Ukrainian war for the future of the international order might be. What challenge does it pose to what we often call the liberal international order or the post-1945 international order? Now, it's worth recalling that this question of the sort of fate of the liberal international order has been occupying thousands and thousands of pages of scholarly manuscripts over the past 5 to 10 years. The liberal international order is widely seen as being in crisis. But the debate has largely focused on a number of apparent weaknesses or frailties with this order. And I think the principal ones have to do with, first of all, the sort of weakening political foundations of the liberal international order, focused principally on the relative decline of the United States and the broader West, and in particular, a sort of declining will to lead the international order on the part of the United States. and the West. So that would be the sort of first thing that people focus on. The second thing has been the paralysis of multilateral institutions and their lack of fit for purpose. So not only have multilateral institutions not been particularly good at dealing with their traditional brief, you know, managing the world economy, dealing with certain forms of, you know, humanitarian crises and so forth, but also that they are charged with now with meeting a whole series of new purposes that they just, like climate change, that they just seem incapable of dealing with in any effective way. The third thing has, and Lauren has touched in some respects on this with the Ukraine crisis, has been the sort of sense of a weakening of international law, that international law's inability to really constrain the kinds of things or to regulate the kinds of things that it's intended to do. And then the fourth, and this is widely discussed in the context of the liberal international order, is what some scholars have called the end times of human rights, that the great heyday of the promotion of human rights is failing, and that what we're seeing is an increase in human rights violations across the world. Now, I think that the Ukrainian war touches on all of those aspects of the crisis of the liberal international order, but I think it also cuts far deeper into the foundations of this international order. And I mean this in three senses. The first is that the Ukrainian war, or the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, is a direct challenge to the underlying constitutional principles of the post-1945 order. And that principle is that political authority on the globe should be distributed on the principle of territorial sovereignty, not on the basis of empire. The second challenge, and way in which this war cuts deep into the foundations, has to do with the justifications that have been used on the part of the Russians for this invasion. Now, of course, there are a number of different layers to these justifications. There's the justification that this was to prevent a non-existing genocide from taking place. But the principal justification, if you read Putin's writings, is that the invasion is justified to re-establish a historical unity between Russia and the Ukraine. That, now, this is a justification that in international terms is decidedly anachronistic. It's a 19th century and early 20th century justification for the use of force. It's a principle that the last time we saw a great power in the international system use that as a justification for invading another territory and seizing it was Hitler's use of a quest for a greater Germany in the Second World War. And the international community, for understandable reasons, has rejected that as a justification for the use of force since 1945. And the fact that this is articulated again as a justification for the use of force is, I think, very worrying. And third, I think the third challenge, and in some ways this is, you know, overlaps the others, is almost the most important, is that historically stable international orders that meet the minimal requirement of preventing great power war depend on the European experience on agreed norms of security governance. We saw this after the Napoleonic Wars, we saw it after the First World War, we saw it after the Second World War. Yet since the end of the Cold War, this is precisely what has been missing. There have been no agreed norms among the great powers in Europe about security governance. Even the norms that existed during the Cold War gradually built up around, that gave a kind of normative institutionalized structure of the Cold War. Think of the Helsinki Accords, which codified European borders, post-war borders. No such rules exist today. And I'll end by saying that one of the most dangerous features of this current crisis is not only are there no agreed norms about security governance in the heart of Europe, there are no agreed norms of security governance in East Asia either. And this represents, I think, a particularly dangerous period in international history, and that one of the key things that's needed going forward is an effort on the part, particularly of Western leaders, but also of other leaders, to try and move toward a negotiated set of norms that all major powers in the system can agree on to stabilise the security order. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Chris. Andrew, over to you. And in typical style, Andrew takes his own time, like stops his own time. Yeah.
Okay, folks, I'd like to address three issues. The first is what Putin has sought to achieve in Ukraine. The second, why he has failed so far. And the third, where to from here. So to begin with Putin's objectives, it is essential to note that Vladimir Putin is a revisionist actor in world politics. I use Putin rather than Russia in order to flag that this is a highly personalistic regime, and we need to understand Putin's mindset in order to have an understanding of Russian statecraft at the moment. Putin is revisionist to the extent that he is on record as saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. He is unreconciled to the post-Cold War order, both in Europe and beyond. And with respect to Ukraine in particular, his objectives have been, at a minimum, to arrest what he perceives as Ukraine's ideological and geopolitical and economic drift to the West, and at a maximum, to potentially subordinate Ukraine as, in effect, an informal vassal of the Russian state, and in order, in so doing, to reclaim what he sees as Ukraine's rightful place within the Ruski Mir, the so-called Russian world. It is worth noting also that Putin has historically been a gambler in undertaking the mission in Ukraine. His minimum objective is to neutralise Ukraine and bring it back into the Russian orbit. But it's likely that his maximalist objective would have been to seek to produce a crisis that would dramatise NATO's divisions and to ideally weaken, if not break, the transatlantic alliance. Thus far, and keep in mind, we are less than 2 weeks into the conflict, so prediction's difficult, especially about the future. However, Putin so far has failed for the following reasons. The first, and I'd say it's the most fundamental, is a misunderstanding of the conditions of victory in 2014. In 2014, Putin was able to secure control of the Crimean Peninsula in an almost bloodless, what people have referred to as a hybrid conflict. As a result, he has systematically underestimated the capability and resolve of the Ukrainian military and, more broadly, the level of resolve of the Ukrainian government. And there is a certain irony in the way in which things are playing out at the moment. Unquestionably, the Ukrainian military performed extraordinarily poorly in the armed conflict in Ukraine in 2014. But as a result, they have systematically sought to rebuild their capabilities, in part with Western support. But more broadly, the very effort to try to establish a degree of political control in Ukraine through the consolidation of a frozen conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk has in fact accelerated the shift of Ukraine to the West, so much so that we are now in a situation in which in 2019, the Ukrainian government enshrined a commitment to eventual NATO membership as an element of its constitution. So this has become an institutionalised commitment. More broadly, though, what we have seen is, and I think this is probably, certainly from my vantage point as an international relations scholar, the most surprising element here is an underestimation so far of Western unity and resolve and willingness to resist the incursion in Ukraine. It is absolutely remarkable that the NATO alliance has been so overt in its decision to supply military aid to the Ukrainian resistance. And that's something that must be said. Vladimir Putin would probably be, I don't like to forgive him really for anything, but he would probably be forgiven for underestimating Western resolve in that instance. So where to from here? I am not optimistic about the short to medium term prospects for a peaceful resolution in the Ukraine conflict. The most basic reason for that is a fundamental clash between an outcome that would be acceptable for the Kremlin and an outcome that would be acceptable to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people more generally. Putin's fear is that any negotiation that was struck, for example, a commitment on the part of Ukraine to recognise Russian suzerainty in Donetsk and Luhansk, to accept the dismemberment of their country through the removal of Crimea, to accept permanent neutralisation, that this is a bargain that would potentially obsolesce in the event of a Russian withdrawal. And his fears are well founded there. It's relatively unknown, but Zelensky was seen by many in Ukraine as being too soft on Russia, too willing to accommodate before the onset of this conflict. There is very little in the way of bargaining room for Zelensky and very little in the way of a common degree of convergence in Ukrainian and Russian interests to facilitate peace. I will end simply on this note that at this point, Putin and the Putin regime are very much boxed into a corner and are boxed into a corner of their own making. Their options are to escalate. And we know that it is likely from what we have seen in the past, whether it be in Grozny, whether it is in Aleppo, that a step to escalate on the part of the Putin regime will be to increase its use of atrocity crimes in order to destabilise Ukraine, in order to further accelerate a refugee flows into Europe, in order to try to maximise the level of instability and chaos necessary to push the West to in turn prevail upon Ukraine in order to accommodate Russian desires. The reality, however, is that Ukraine has the capacity to sustain a long-term insurgency, has the capacity, for example, to retrench from Kiev to Lviv or even to maintain the government in exile. At the end of the day, Ukraine is a country that is larger than France. Counterinsurgency is an extraordinarily labour-intensive exercise, and the Ukrainian government and people retain for the foreseeable future the capacity to make any occupation an extraordinarily costly proposition for Putin. So no happy news, but I'll leave it to Sarah to hopefully lighten the mood. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Andrew. And Sarah.
Yeah, sorry, no lightness here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of the Ukraine-Russia conflict for China. In particular, there's been a lot of commentary lately that talks about this arc of autocracy, these fears of authoritarian alignment, drawing similarities between Russia and China. And I just want to stress the differences between them, particularly when it comes to these, what we see as irredentist claims and questions about what does this mean for the situation in Taiwan in particular. So one thing in that regard is that we need to think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a continuation rather than an aberration in Russian foreign policy when it comes to the use of military force. We see that in Georgia and in Ukraine. Andrew mentioned Ukraine of 2014, we see that earlier, but also more recently in Syria. And in this respect, we have commentators noting that military force is in fact has become a key tool of Russian foreign policy. And that really is not the same when we look at China. China certainly has become more aggressive in recent years. We think about military installations in the South China Sea, the military confrontations with India for border disputes there. But China has no experience in the type of war campaign that Russia is carrying out. It hasn't fought a major military war since 1979 in its invasion of Vietnam. And on top of that, we see a People's Liberation Army that seems to have a much higher casualty aversion than we would see on the part of Moscow. There are other lessons from Ukraine that seem to make it even less likely that China would take similar actions in Taiwan. One is that Andrew had alluded to the speed at which the world united in opposition to Russia and the scale of the sanctions would be unsettling to Beijing. Many experts suggest that China will attempt to further sanction-proof its economy, but this is incredibly difficult, particularly when we think about the SWIFT system that Russia has been kicked off of. This remains the most efficient system for international financial transactions for banks, and being removed from that system would be potentially devastating to the Chinese economy. We also see that in addition to this having less of a military action as a tool of foreign policy, that China is more dispositionally and historically sensitive to political isolation than Russia is. So look at recent action on the UN Security Council, where China is seen to be taking a more assertive role. That has always been jointly with Russia. It's cast these joint vetoes with Russia in regard to the Syria situation. We see that the type of political isolation, not just economic, that Russia is experiencing at the moment, runs counter to many of the contemporary narratives about China in the world, how China sees itself and how it sees this idea. We think about Xi Jinping sayings of a common destiny for mankind, that China is out for creating a peaceful, harmonious world, that the political isolation that China is confronting at the moment is more difficult for China to wear than it is for Russia. We also see in Russia at the moment an underestimation of not just the scale at which would be isolated internationally, but the amount of domestic protests that are taking place in Russia at the moment. Cities all throughout Russia, we're seeing people come to the street in opposition to this war in a way that, even with the coercive power of the Chinese government against its domestic population when it comes to public protest, that this would be concerning in the least to think of any amount of domestic resistance to the scale that Russia is seeing for its incursions for its invasion of Ukraine. Then another point, and a point that's been made already, is the extent to which Putin drastically underestimated the Ukrainian resistance. There's some reporting to suggest that China was caught off guard when it came to the invasion, that Russia had given assurances that it wouldn't. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think that there was some forewarning. Most of the intelligence analysis that's been publicly reported on suggests that. But what does seem to have caught Xi Jinping off guard is that he believed in Putin's assurance that this would be very short and very swift, that Ukraine would be subdued within a matter of 24, 48, 72 hours. That has not been the case. And the reason this is confronting, or potentially confronting, for China is that it has a similar narrative when it comes to Taiwan, that Taiwan, the preponderance of the Chinese military would subdue Taiwan in a relatively short period of time. And the level of resistance, both domestically and its isolation externally, and its support through advanced weaponry externally, I should say, for Ukraine, is a further deterrent, I would think, for Beijing. That's all even without sort of a sheer military analysis that suggests that Taiwan is better placed than Ukraine to defend itself. Diplomatically, it has a defense pact with the US, or a de facto defense pact through the Taiwan Relations Act. And strategically, it has it's not so easy to access because it's an island with a complex geography and advanced military. We see also repeatedly that in analysis how China doesn't want to be embarrassed in the way that it senses the Russians have been embarrassed. We see, for example, reporting all through Western media about Russia as a Potemkin power. And this is something that is off-putting, or at least a sign of warning for China. And I think I'll wrap it up there because I'm getting some signs to cut it.
Well, thank you very much for the four of you. I think that must have sparked a couple of thoughts if you hadn't come here with questions in the first place. So we will obviously have you guys come in, both here in the room, but also through Zoom here. If you want to ask a question here in the room, just raise your hand, and the wonderful Chloe or myself will come around with a microphone, okay? Before we start doing this, 3 little wishes personally from myself, okay? We have to acknowledge that something like war is probably one amongst the worst things that us as humans can do. It stirs emotions. And so I would like to encourage everyone that we treat each other with respect. This is not a political forum. This is a forum to do an academic reflection on what's happening right now. Secondly, try and be succinct because we try to bring in as many of you as possible. And then finally, before you speak, just quickly let us know who you are so we know who is joining the conversation. All right. So anyone here in the room who would like to start? Okay, let's go to this gentleman up here, Chloe, with the glasses first. And
thank you. I think I would like.
Can you also quickly tell us who you are? Sorry.
Oh, my name's Ben. I would like to ask a question for Sarah. I think is that. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi,
so what? Yeah.
Hi, Sarah. I do have a question, and it's that well, for starters, Fiona Hill, a former member of the U.S. National Security Council, outlined in a political interview last week that we're already in World War III, and we have been for some time. Do you agree with that assessment, or is the Ukraine invasion a precursor to it? Or even more so, are we entering a new Cold War where other countries like China could bide its time to actually start World War III?
Great, thank you, Ben. Let's take a second question at the same time, and then Sarah, we can answer.
Oh, hello. My name is Victoria Brinza, and I'm a Ukrainian sociologist. I would like to hear your opinion on what solutions there could be to this situation, taking into account that Russia has never seen Ukraine as a subject, as an actor in the international politics. So I would like to hear what you think. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Sarah, why don't you kick it off?
Thanks, Ben. Are we in World War III? Well, I think that the strategic analysts here, Andrew or even Chris, might be better placed to answer that than I am. But I think that to the extent that we are seeing the arming of Ukraine, but not direct military engagement, I mean, NATO and the US have been extremely clear in that the US would not engage directly militarily because of the fear of something like a great power war. There's also concerns that, I mean, with Russia's nuclear posturing of what that would mean. Now, if the question is, are we in something of a great power confrontation that has, you know, we hear of our own government talking, as I said before, the arc of autocracy versus Chris talking about Europe needing to have a greater sense of European security and a European identity, that I do think that we are seeing greater fissures in the international system now than we have since the end of the Cold War. I wonder if either of you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point to acknowledge the fragility of the international system at the moment that the conflict in Ukraine dramatises. I think in terms of the claim that we are already in the early stages of World War III, I would, similarly to Sarah, I would accept that we are at a point at which the division between authoritarian versus broadly democratic blocs in international politics is consolidating. And I would suspect that particularly if Russia goes on to endure a prolonged period of economic and diplomatic estrangement from the West, that will by necessity tilt it towards greater economic dependence on China. That said, in terms of the risk of an escalation into World War III, there is a certain paradox here, and the paradox lies with the role of nuclear weapons in the conflict. On the one hand, the possession of nuclear weapons has given Putin the degree of confidence that he can undertake aggression in his local neighbourhood without the risk of intervention from the West. Ironically, though, if things continue to go badly for him, there is also the risk that he will, as per Russian doctrine, contemplate the use of nuclear weapons paradoxically to escalate to de-escalate. That is, that he might in extremis consider the use most likely of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine in order to get the West to back off. Then, of course, that would be crossing a really important threshold that we haven't seen crossed since 1945, the use of nuclear weapons forcibly in world conflict. The question would be how NATO would be likely to respond. The early indications, given that NATO has been so far reluctant to extend more than direct military assistance to Ukraine, are that Putin would be likely to freeze the conflict. But the reality, though, is that even then he would not be able to prevail in it. It's a rather extended answer. Would anyone else like to offer thoughts? Yeah. I'm happy to open it up to others here. But I would agree with your initial proposition, which is that, to me, the sense is that it is very difficult to envisage a diplomatic resolution without an acknowledgement of Ukraine's independent status as an agent in world politics. And unfortunately, I do not see the current regime in Moscow as being ideologically capable of making that acknowledgement. To me, the closest analogy would be, and I concede from the outset that this is an imperfect analogy, but I think of the conflict, the settler colonial conflict between Britain and Ireland, which by the time we see the end of the Irish War of Independence, ultimately the Irish are forced through the shadow of further coercion to grant various concessions in order to get a limited degree of independence. My concern is that if the conflict were to continue, that Ukraine might be forced, might be pressured by the West to accept a less than totally independent status in terms of particularly its relationship to NATO. On the other hand, and this goes back to a point that Chris made about the evolving character of the international system, we are now in a much more of a post-imperial world where that kind of accommodation would be very difficult to legitimise to Ukrainians. So that would be my observations there.
Sadly, in order for us to get a resolution to the conflict, as Andrew said, you need to get some common ground between the parties as to what might be concessions they'd be willing to make. And I can't see that ground appearing over the horizon anytime soon. And so in a sense, the challenge, I mean, one of the things, historically that we've seen is that in precisely that part of Europe, historically, is that, peace has been constructed out of conflict, principally. And part of the problem is that we've had a European security order develop over the last 30 years that was not based on common norms that straddled Eastern Europe and Russia in particular and Western Europe. And unfortunately, probably the only prospect of getting to the point where anyone will negotiate those is actually through the trauma of the conflict, which is not what I want to see, but it's what I think is going to be the story going forward. But I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, I want to bring in two particular questions from the Zoom chat here, because these are the kind of comments and questions we tend to get, and I've come across a lot. I'd like to sort of hear who of you would like to engage with that. Okay, so I think you need to go down a bit. Where was the original? Yeah, no. Okay, sorry, go back. The chat has evolved. Okay, so two questions here. The first one here from Irfan. Do you think that what Russia did to Ukraine is equivalent to what the US, Britain, and Australia did in 19 years ago to Iraq? Okay, that's one question. And the second one is, what do you as a panel think about the narrative that Putin is simply retaliating to the unnecessary eastward expansion of NATO, especially considering that NATO should really be viewed as unnecessarily following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which was the original intent of the creation of NATO? What about the agreement between Gorbachev and James Baker in 1990 that NATO would not expand to the east if Russia accepted Germany's reunification? I bring those up because these arguments have been obviously articulated a lot. I'd like to hear who would like to start responding to either of those.
It's for Lauren to do the one.
Yeah. Lauren, you want to start?
Thanks. Well, I think that it's on. Yeah. So a justification for using force to respond from an international law perspective is required to be either in self-defense or in collective self-defense of another state. So the justification that was used in the conflict in Iraq by America, Australia, and the United Kingdom, regardless on the intelligence issue and whether that intelligence was accurate or not, was on the basis of collective self-defense of Iraq in terms of the individuals there. So the authority existed under Article 51 as a self-defense regime in terms of responding to the regime that was in place at the time, as compared now where we've got an invading state in response to the baseless facts when we're talking about the allegations of genocide and the suggestion that there is a secessionist movement in those two regions. So I think the difference is noting that there has been a lot of discussion about the intelligence basis of that invasion in the first instance. There was a different set of facts to justify the use of force in those situations. And in this situation, the facts that have been used or attempted to be used by Putin to justify that incursion are baseless and have been called out as that by the international community at the time of the invasion.
I'll just add something. If I could just add to that, I think one thing that's really important to remember is that both of these wars have been ultimately seen as being illegitimate internationally. And, in that respect, they, both were seen as being fundamental challenges to international norms and illegitimate. They didn't have Security Council authorization for the Iraq invasion. And so I think that in some senses there is a parallel, but it might not be the parallel that underlies the question.
Yeah.
I'll take the NATO question if that's okay. And I think it's an important question to address in that you have everyone on the spectrum from people that are quite radical to offensive realists like John Mearsheimer have invoked the spectre of NATO's expansion in order to give some kind of contextualisation to Russia's recent activities. I will be completely transparent. I think it's an important argument to address. I find it fundamentally unconvincing. And here's why. First, the claim that NATO as a Cold War relic, it was always only about keeping Russia out, is incorrect. If we look at the rationale for NATO, it was always to keep America in, that is, America formally involved in the European security architecture, to keep Germany down, that is, to keep Germany integrated in a security system that would allay the concerns of its neighbours. And yes, third, to prevent the recurrence or the threat of aggression from originally the Soviet Union. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, that NATO has always served multiple purposes. Second, the narrative that a promise was made, a promise was extended to abolish NATO or to prevent its further expansion into the East is one that continues to be significantly contested. Third, regardless of whether a promise was made or not, by the time we get to 1997 and the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the Russian Federation has at that point reconciled itself to the continued post-Cold War existence to NATO and has not raised the in-principle objections that NATO might expand further to the east, which was already on the cards in 1997. I've lost count of the number of points that I'm going through, but I'm not done. So let's go to the next one. Well, NATO, big bad NATO poses an existential threat to the Russian Federation, therefore warranting its aggression. Let's be real about this. The last expansion of NATO in terms of the NATO alliance, it acquired North Macedonia as a member in 2020, but the last real expansion of it in a way that could credibly be seen as a geopolitical threat to the Russian Federation occurred with the accession of the Baltic states to NATO in 2004. And we are seeing the argument of NATO expansion being invoked to justify Russian aggression in 2002 as an explanation for why Vladimir Putin is behaving the way that he does. I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. And I don't buy it, lastly, because we have seen repeated aggression and expansion on the part of Russia, not merely at the conventional level, but also in terms of multiple efforts to undermine the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which collapsed in 2020. What we need to recognise is that the Putin regime is fundamentally revisionist in its orientation. Putin is still recovering from the trauma of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it is a powerful argument that he can use to justify his expansion, but it is absolutely critical for us to distinguish between justification versus motivation. And I'll end my rant there.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have a question in the back. Someone raised, I think a lady in the back raised her hand earlier. Okay, and then is there someone maybe in this part of the room? Okay, we'll take these two questions together again.
Okay, actually I have two questions.
And can you also tell us who you are?
My name is Elham Mohammad Nijad, and I'm doing Master of International Law and International Relations. And my question is, my first question has been answered, but because they usually say that NATO never basically invade another country, and that's why we cannot buy the justification for invasion of Ukraine. But the thing is, NATO has invaded Yugoslavia in the Bosnia. So I just want to know, can we basically, based on this ground, say that there are some legitimate concern for the Putin for the invasion? And the other question is, given that Germany has been encouraged to play an active role in Europe, do you think that would have any long-term implications for Europe? That's.
Okay, thank you. And we've got a question here at front.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liam. Just quickly, thank you to all the panelists for giving up your time today. Really appreciate it. My question goes to the Russians and the Ukrainians share a lot of ethnographic similarities, and the Russian forces, a lot's been made of the fact that they're young, inexperienced, and not particularly resolute in their invasion of Ukraine. How does this play into a prolonged occupation?
All right. Who would like to start? Lauren?
I'll take the legal question first. So the United Nations Security Council has authority under the United Nations Charter to vote to authorise all necessary means under Chapter 7 of the Charter to enable the use of force. Effectively, that's shorthand for it authorises the use of force to stop whatever the situation is that they're dealing with. So in the case of the Yugoslavian conflict, there was a United Nations Security Council resolution, and it also spawned a concept of the responsibility to protect, which was the suggestion that the international community has an obligation at international law to intervene where there's mass human rights and atrocities occurring, to then authorise the use of deployment of peacekeeping forces to stop those events occurring. So there was a number of bases that people have declared in that case. I think there's been a bit of a drift away from the RCP, or the responsibility to protect, movement after some of the interventions in Africa in the 90s, but the United Nations Security Council authorization under the 6.5 and the 7 measures, which is sort of the chapters that give those authorizations, is really the difference between a unilateral invasion versus an internationally endorsed action to stop human rights abuses.
Want to address the questions? So Germany and also... Okay, all right. Very quickly on the question of Germany's potential resurgence as a European security actor, and with all due respect to my chair, where is he? Yeah. I'll believe it when I see it. If the conflict is protracted, then there will be a strong rationale for Germany to continue what has, I will concede, been a remarkably swift and remarkably bipartisan shift towards increased support for the resistance in Ukraine. The reality, however, is that the German commitment towards a more introverted security posture, if you like, is one that is deeply ingrained and deeply habituated. And as an international relations scholar, what I would approach it would be to say, well, an exogenous shock like the one that we're seeing could potentially deflect Germany onto a more assertive path. But the sense that I get is that that assertive path would nevertheless be very heavily embedded within the current web of institutional arrangements that it's in terms of NATO and European expansion. I don't see Germany striking out on its own. Liam, with your question in regards to the relationship between perceived co-ethnic affiliation and the potential demoralisation of Russian forces, yeah, I think that you're spot on. In the immediate instance, there has been significant evidence of low Russian morale, and that's partially because of the disconnect between the rationale that our understanding is that their troops have been given, which is that this is not a war, it's a form of peacekeeping mission in which they would be expecting to be welcomed by the locals, and the less than welcoming reception that they've received. The larger question is what Putin does about this over time. As the insurgency becomes protracted, and this is extrapolating from historical cases, it is likely that Putin would seek to neutralise that as a concern. That would be through greater reliance on special forces. That would be through greater reliance on tactics, for example, which is one that I expect that we'll continue to see, of saying, well, we'll open up a humanitarian corridor for people to leave urban centres, and anyone that's left is by definition a neo-Nazi or a thug or the like. The final tactic that we're likely to see is an effort to cultivate other groups that are not necessarily have the same level of ethnic affinity. I'm surprised at stories that are already coming out of reliance on the Wagner group of mercenaries, or stories even today of relying on Syrian support in order to advance Russian objectives. That could be a way of actually trying to neutralise the problem that you've identified. If those reports are true, it suggests to me a fairly high level of desperation at an unusually early stage in the conflict.
Thank you. We've got Chloe, a question over there, and we've got a question here, and then we'll continue.
My name's Angus. I'm doing International Relations Masters. I was just wondering whether, I haven't heard much spoken or written about this, but do you think that Russia is now closer to becoming a failed state with the sanctions, and if the military campaign really bogs down?
Hello, sorry. Hi, my name's Carl. I'm Bachelor of International Studies Honours in Russian. My question's regarding, none of you four have said this explicitly, but it seems implicit, and you could probably answer this question because it's quite ubiquitous in the discourse at the moment, that we're kind of seeing a return of great power politics that we haven't really had for, potentially since World War II, or at least 1991. And I don't necessarily challenge that, but I'm a little confused by that statement because, obviously we have that with World War II. It's quite clear we have that with the Cold War and mutually assured destruction, and there's a massive appetite for war then in proxy wars. And I don't really see how US hegemony, sort of world domination, isn't a type of great power politics. So obviously what Russia's doing is a big change, it's shaking things up to the liberal international order, US hegemony, the way things have been arguably since 1945, definitely since 1991. But maybe you could answer to what extent, I don't quite understand how great power politics ever went away. Maybe there's a bit of a realist way of understanding things, but I struggle to see liberal international order and US hegemony as not being just a different form of great power politics.
That's a really good question. I'm certainly on my part, I did not mean to imply a return of great power politics. Great power politics never went away. Great power politics might change form, though, over time. And I think, and expressions of great power politics may take different forms. And I think what we're seeing in Russia's behaviour, and Putin's behaviour, is, in fact, a return to a kind of model of great power behaviour that is in a sense is a 19th century model. And I think, and so I wouldn't phrase it as being that great power politics has returned. I would phrase it as being there are different complexions and configurations of great power politics over time, and that what we're seeing is new expressions or in a sense returns of old expressions and conflicts between different models of great power politics. I mean, if you talk about the major powers in the international system at the moment, and I think Sarah did a really great job of talking about China's dispositions, then you have great powers that have very different orientations toward and understandings of their place in the world and their place in the institutional architecture of the international order. And part of the problem at the moment is that is that there's dissonance between those visions and understandings.
I just want to add to that from a legal perspective. The way that the United Nations Charter is established, the way that we have 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council who have veto powers, recognises that there are a number of great powers that will always be in contestation, and they have different authorities to do different things within the international order, then with fallback mechanisms to address aberrations of behaviour like we've seen here. So we've got the veto power in relation to substantive resolutions under the United Nations Security Council, but then with a resolution that we saw last week referring to the United Nations General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace resolution from the 1950s. So there are those examples of the system being designed around that great power politics. So I think it's expected to see it as far as the basis of the order itself.
Okay, well, fighting over who will take your failed state question. Just in terms of what we think about, I think the terminology failed state kind of is bandied about without kind of a substantive idea of what failed state means. If we think about a failed state, it's the inability to control territory, to enter into some sort of foreign policy, to have some sort of central government, taxation systems, the like. I don't think that applies very well to the Russian situation. What I think we can talk about when it comes to Russia is the type of economic devastation it might have, and domestic unrest potentially. But I don't know that it's a particularly useful way of thinking about it as a failed state, because it will still have so much of the recognition of a state and the control of a territory that we think about under international law as being the workings of a state. And we can think about states all over the world today that are in a worse position than Russia that we wouldn't call failed states. So I don't know how just analytically useful that is, but I think that the cutting question may be, what are the sort of fallouts of Russia's isolation and the crippling sanctions, and what are the implications of that for Putin's ability to govern and Russia's ability to function on a daily basis?
Okay, thank you. I think we'll go to the next question here, Will, and then I'll take a question that we have online.
I'm Will. I'm in the Masters of Peace, Conflict and IR. Had 2 questions, both out of what Lauren said. The first one was just around the ICJ rejecting Russia's claim of projecting a genocide as a legitimate reason to go to war. What does that really mean for sort of R2P, I suppose, if that's now just been thrown out the window? The second one was around the special tribunal, whether that was jumping ahead a few years to the end of this war. Is it the best way to go about prosecuting war criminals, given Russia would have to voluntarily hand them over? They're not members of the Statute of Rome. They're not going to just willingly hand over. If they put a puppet state in Ukraine, they definitely won't do it. So, yeah.
Okay, and the question we have from the chat here is, there have been a few around information warfare. So maybe someone would like to address this, but also then the question of, around the question of, is social media coverage pivotal in the information warfare? And then maybe more generally to you on the panel, like, how are you avoiding misinformation? So, all right.
Thanks. So I think that the rejection by the ICJ on the Russian argument of genocide is rejected on the basis of fact. So it's not based on any legal argument. It's just that the facts don't support that there is a genocide occurring, and it was rejected as being utterly false, I think was the exact phrase by the court in that regard. The so what of the ICJ action is that it enables the court to make provisional measures, which then would allow them to direct Russia to cease its invasion. Obviously, we've seen that's unlikely to be complied with. I mean, most states ignore the International Court of Justice's directions when we're talking about just sailing on the high seas, let alone when we're talking about the middle of an armed conflict. But that actually provides authority for other measures to be taken and justification for sanctions and the like. I don't think it has implications for the R2P concept. I think that the reason we're not seeing the use of force in response by the rest of the world, where we have lawful justification to do so we would have lawful justification to respond in collective self-defense of the Ukraine, is more from a power hedging concerns that I think are better addressed by this part of the panel. So I don't think that's the issue. As far as actually bringing individuals to account, this is one of the enduring problems with international criminal law. The ICC itself is aimed to be, it's got a gravity threshold. It is aimed to be dealing with those that are the orchestrating the worst of the offences against international humanitarian law, and it's expected that if a state is unwilling or unable to act, then the ICC would be able to commence prosecutions. So a special tribunal wouldn't be necessary to deal with anyone other than any other crimes other than the crime of aggression. So there is jurisdiction in relation to any offences that occur in the territory of the Ukraine for the ICC, but the problem would be actually getting a hold of those individuals. The likelihood of Russia handing over anyone after the conflict ends to be subject to the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian domestic courts is unlikely. Unlikely that they would also hand anyone over to the jurisdiction of the ICC. Also unlikely that there'd be a United Nations Security Council resolution, because they would veto that. That said, the Russians do have a history of military tribunals. They have a fairly complex military discipline system. I think recently there's some writings about trials for soldiers who killed civilians during the Chechen conflict. So there is some indication that Russians will hold individual soldiers to account for misconduct during armed conflict. But the international measures like the ICC and a special tribunal are more looking at the people who are actually orchestrating or directing the worst of the atrocities.
Yeah, I might just respond to that R2P question again. It seems when we look at this, Russia just threw every argument against the wall and saw what stuck, right? It didn't recognize Ukraine as a sovereign country anymore. It then took the contested regions and recognized them as independent countries. And then when that, in that mix, it threw in, also there's a genocide occurring and they're all Nazis, right? So in this regard, I think that taking all of those different arguments actually alienates the argument on genocide even more. That the fact that when you look at Russians' argumentation in the Security Council, when it has come to legitimate concerns about atrocities taking place, like in Syria, and it says that this is the sovereignty of the country, that we should be respected, we should we should let the national government have control over this and defer to them, that it's just such a spurious argument that it's difficult to see that it having any normative traction when it comes to destabilizing norms, when it comes to protection of citizens abroad who are being targeted by their governments for atrocities.
So I will say the fact that Putin tried to justify his actions using all of these legal arguments is heartening for me, that he's trying to actually use the legal order and not rejecting it outright and just doing crazy Putin things. So this is an indication that there is recognition of these international legal norms as having power for him to justify his actions, even though they are completely spurious.
Okay, we have the question also from Information Warfare and how you...
I'm happy to address that if you like. Yeah. And I think there's no question that so far that Ukraine is streets ahead of Russia in terms of information warfare. And I would say that simply on the basis of, if you're looking at information warfare as people increasingly characterise it as its own distinct domain of warfare, but the way that you would assess it would be, okay, well, what are the intended political effects of Ukrainian information warfare? To fortify their own resolve and to catalyse diplomatic, economic, and if possible, military support from powerful external actors, i.e. the West. And thus far, they have been extraordinarily successful at doing that and at leveraging Western-dominated social media networks in order to get that message out. Russia, by contrast, I think has overestimated the effectiveness of the previous use of disinformation, misinformation in order to chip away at the resolve of the West. The question will be the degree to which, it's a classic Clausewitzian dictum that the enemy always adapts as warfare progresses. So the question would be the degree to which the Russians will be capable of eventually tailoring messages to target the constituencies that they need to mobilise in order to secure and maintain support. So on the one hand, that would be the Russian people themselves. And there is evidence that for all of the talk of certainly younger people getting behind anti-war protests, that if you are a Russian boomer, for example, if you like, you're watching state-dominated TV, all of those old legacy media platforms are still relatively capable of eliciting that kind of will and resolve in the first instance. On the second question, which I thought was a really important and interesting one, is how do you try to avoid misinformation yourself? I'm going to be glib here and stay off social media, or at least in being slightly less glib, although glibness is a characteristic of mine. One of the great dangers that I found in the first 72 hours of the conflict is that I was almost constantly on social media during that period. And I think that obsession with second by second, play by play focus, the issue of that is that once a myth has consolidated, it becomes sticky even in the face of subsequent disconfirmation. So there's a big focus early on of the ghost of Kiev, a fighter pilot from the Ukrainian Air Force that was having this extraordinary kill rate against his adversaries, and that people bought into it emotionally. And there's subsequently quite a lot of evidence that has been either disproven or at least very much wound back. If you are stuck in a permanent chase for that dopamine and novelty on social media, that's going to be a problem. And I know that because I'm guilty of that myself. The second thing that I would say in terms of, and it's just sort of, you are all digital natives more than I can ever be, but is just consume a diverse amount of media from different sources. If possible, those of you that have language capabilities in other languages, see how the conflict is being reported outside of the West. And the reason I say that is if we look at the votes to censure Russia, what I found notable about that is that there were conspicuous absences from key regional players. For example, if we look at our own region, Japan, South Korea, Singapore and Timor-Leste supported sanctioning Russia for its aggression. There were conspicuous absences there. So if you can, you do have those linguistic capabilities to certainly see the difference between how the conflict is being treated in the English-speaking press versus elsewhere.
Okay, I'd like to take 3 questions together. So we'll start here, and then we got one here, and then we got.
Hi, my name's Callum. We saw that last year was the century for the CCP's, well, for the ruling of China for the CCP, sorry. And we can see that full unification of China is a massive priority for the CCP, but we've just seen that the Ukrainian crisis has really shook up or can shake up Chinese policy there. Where would we say, or what would you say is sort of the future of that cultural political narrative that the CCP projects as part of the unification with Taiwan?
Okay, that's the first one. We go a second question here, and then Tim over there.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm an undergraduate student studying Western civilization. My question to the panel is, we've seen the development of a lot of invasion discourse, I think, with previous regions that have been targeted by Russia in the recent past, so in the Caucasus, the Baltics, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, fearing that a similar situation could occur to them as is happening in Ukraine. Do you think that this is in any way realistic with Putin's potential foreign policy goals going into the future? Or do you think the invasion of Ukraine is more a prophylactic measure to scare off the West, potentially from becoming more involved in these regions as they have been? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll take the third one as well.
Thanks, Seb. Richard, PhD candidate. So my question is in terms of a Russian perspective, what we're looking at now is likely around about the worst case scenario for them in terms of the sanctions that are upon Russia, but reasonably could have been anticipated by Russia that could happen. Sarah, you mentioned that that's created some dynamics around the reliance on trade with the PRC. So my question then is, what is the risk of Russia becoming a junior partner to the PRC? And then why would Putin take such a risk?
Would like to go first, Sarah?
Yeah, so I think I kind of have 2 questions there. The first is the implications of this on China's narrative when it comes to unification. And I would say that that's unshakable, that it is such a core. We see the 20th Congress coming up this year. It is more than ever being touted as a core aim of China and under Xi. And it is no wavering from that. I think that the rumblings underneath would be questions about the extent to which that is militarily achievable. There have been in recent years huge soft power and cyber attempts to have the unification become a reality. I was just reading today about the cultivating of Taiwanese vloggers to influence public opinion in favor of China. But I think that in terms of the overarching narrative, it's unshakable. When it comes to the risks of Russia being a client partner or junior partner to China, I think that to some extent, Russia doesn't have a lot of options at the moment because it's the only friend it sees on the horizon. In fact, this was even a Russian spokesperson saying this when they said, a question was asked, you're totally isolated. And they're like, oh, no, wait, we have China. But we see in just in the last few days, China, although it had quite vehement, I would say, support for Russia in the initial period. Basically, we see both China's official and semi-official discourse, its public discourse, echoing Russia's narrative that this was caused by the US. It was NATO's overtures into Russia's periphery that was the cause of this. You see the very spicy commentary from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokespeople about the US throwing oil over fire and then expecting someone else to take care of it. But as much as we may see this as going back to your question, that Russia as a client partner, not only does Russia not have many options, but I don't think that China wants to be in that situation. We see China pushing back a little. Now, there are some advantages. You look at an analysis on this and saying that there are some advantages that China could glean from this, but they also could see how Russia's isolation and Russia's, that they don't want to be associated with it, that they don't want to be seen as propping up what seems to be increasingly the view in Beijing, an erratic power that is not heeding sort of sound analysis of the situation. And, you know, China doesn't want to be banded with the loser, right? Like it doesn't.
Just on that question, I mean, I think I've always looked at the China-Russia relationship as a sort of marriage of convenience. You know, that it's been convenient for them both to articulate a particular, in overly florid terms, often quite recently, of this strong bond between them and these common goals that they have, and the common goals bear almost no relationship to what they actually do, or that there's any commonality between them. And I think that there's actually very real potential for that to for very real tensions to emerge in that relationship, and for the costs to China of that relationship to mount ever higher. Just if I could respond to the question about what is this, you know, did Putin just in going into Ukraine, was this sort of demonstration effect to push back the West, and that was all? I think that my own view is that actually Putin's ambitions were larger than Ukraine, not an invasion of Europe, but I think it's not implausible to imagine ambitions that extended into the Baltics. And I think he was really looking to see how the West responded. And if the West had responded without with what we've seen, I actually think that we might have seen down the track some further military incursions on the assumption that, well, if the West didn't bite there, where will they actually bite? And that would fit with the larger narrative about the kind of reunifying this sort of greater Russia, the historical Russia. But I think that's really changed now. I think Putin's got a war that he didn't expect, as Andrew's really detailed. And I think probably those things are off the cards at the moment, or off the table at present. But that's largely because of the way this conflict is playing out.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of those points. In a lot of the literature on strategy, people make the distinction between a grand strategy versus an emergent strategy. And a grand strategy kind of hinges on the idea, well, you've got someone who works with a clear, preordained blueprint, and then a sequential series of actions that follow from that. Increasingly, there's a lot of intuition that says, well, no, a lot of the time a strategy is emergent and iterative and interactive with, you know, how what feedback that you are getting. So I guess to echo Chris, I mean, I would agree that I think, yes, certainly Putin has foregrounded the defensive motivations and, yeah, as you said, a prophylactic move against the West. But we have to situate it within the broader mosaic of his outlook, which is that he has built an alternative set of institutions, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a Eurasia-wide architecture that does indicate that there's a different order that he wants to construct. He's someone who said the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he does have a vast post-imperial Russophone diaspora, often in places like the Baltics with limited citizenship rights, that he can potentially pull that lever and see if it exerts a reaction. And this actually links quite well with Richard's question, which is, okay, well, he's undertaken a gamble and it appears not to have paid off and could have all sorts of negative consequences. How do we account for that? Well, first, it's worth noting the Clausewitzian dictum, war is always a gamble. People go into it with differing levels of risk aversion. But again, it's worth noting, if we contextualise this within Putin's broader political career, he's rolled the dice repeatedly, and up until now, it's largely paid off. Second Chechen War catapulted him into power. In 2008, a bloodier than he would have liked war in Georgia, but one that nevertheless seemed to secure his immediate strategic objectives. The use of extraordinary violence in Syria in order to successfully prop up a client dictator there. Again, in 2014, the successful limited use of force to secure Crimea and to, at least for a period of time, paralyse Ukraine. So I think if we look at it within that broader context, I think, yes, this is someone who is relatively risk acceptant, but it's someone whose current strategic miscalculations can be read within that context of someone who up until now has been rolling the dice and consistently winning.
Okay, we're nearly at the end, but I'd like to quickly give 1 minute to each of our panelists. Maybe with a question over, since we're all students in different ways, students of international law and international politics, what are the thing or the one question that you would think should be at the forefront of our thinking moving onwards from here?
Thanks. I think what we have heard, unfortunately, today is that the immediate future is grim, in that this is not a blitzkrieg action. This is now transitioned into what is going to be a slog of a conflict when we're talking about urban conflict. So I think that any question that we should be thinking about this conflict should have the impact of this violence upon the civilian population at the forefront of our mind. And I think it's quite easy to talk generally about strategy and esoterically about international world order without thinking about the immediate impact those decisions are having on the individuals on the ground. And I think from my perspective anyway, exerting whatever pressure we can to bring that conflict to an end as swiftly as possible, and then dealing with those diplomatic and consequential strategic issues after the fact.
Right. I think I'd probably start with two admonitions. Perception is everything in politics, and weakness is provocative. And right now, Russia appears dramatically weaker than it would have been perceived even a month ago. There have been military failures thus far in the operation that have been simultaneously banal and profound. Failures of basic military logistics, a dramatisation of the fact that Russia is not capable of joint operations of the level of sophistication that we would normally credit and expect of a great power. So I guess two of the things to think about would be, first, what are likely to be the second and third order consequences of an enhanced perception of Russian weakness in world politics? And second, thinking in the longer term and potentially beyond Putin, how do we potentially reconfigure international order in a way that respects Russia's genuine security interests and identification of itself as being a significant power in world politics, but that actually remains sensitive to the legitimate, important and urgent demands of national self-determination of its neighbours?
I think the critical question going forward is, how do we limit the violence of the Ukrainian war to minimise the humanitarian disaster that's unfolding, while at the same time moving into a more proactive diplomatic mode where we can start to think about the norms that might govern a European security order post-Ukraine. And I think that's the critical thinking that needs to take place going forward.
I'm just going to answer that with something that I find particularly puzzling out of this. And it's in that Russia having this narrative itself that it was going to prevail in about 24 hours, and China having that own narrative. And we look at similar analogies. The Saudi Arabia had similar ideas of how it would prevail in Yemen. The US had this in Iraq. And I just think in this situation that it seems across the board that governments are overestimating their ability. And now to prevail in military terms, Russia has some examples in recent history of being able to do that. But in this situation, it really seems to me that China and Russia in particular may be falling prey to their own propaganda apparatus. And what I find just maybe intellectually interesting in this is what are the implications of this if we're seeing them sort of them buying their own craziness to some extent, of it being reproduced so often in this system of closed information that they're starting to make decisions based on that information bubble that put them in a situation of making them worse off. And that's something that I'm grappling with as I look at Chinese domestic narratives on this and secondary analysis that suggests that they kind of believe some of the propaganda that's being put forward because it's recycled so often. And if I can just add a second point, China has offered to mediate in this conflict very recently, and has said the Ukraine government has suggested that China could do so. And so the other point that I'm really interested in going forward is the extent to which China might take on that role, and that it would find itself, that there's a lot of risks entailed in this for China, because it is an incredibly more difficult scenario to end a war than to begin it. And I think that we will see China's narrative about its ability to promote a peaceful solution running up against the hard realities of that happening. And the extent to which Chinese officials and diplomats are engaged in that is a really interesting prospect for me.
I think this is a nice way to round things up. I mean, I know I have to give an apology. There were at least, I think I counted 8 or 9 more hands, probably more, that didn't give you a chance to speak. I know that there's even more questions out on Zoom, but hopefully we got quite a range in here. Thank you so much to you guys for coming here in person, to those of you joining through Zoom. I also want to thank both Emily here and Chloe, wherever she's sitting, without whose work in the background, not just holding microphones and monitoring the chat, but setting this all up, this wouldn't have happened. And of course, first and foremost, thanks so much to Lauren, Sarah, Chris, and Andrew.